Hello, and welcome to Fiction Fans, a podcast where we read books. And other words, too. I'm Lily.
And I'm Sarah.
And before we begin our topic of conversation for this evening, which is Soul Music by Terry Pratchett, Sarah, why don't you kick us off with something great that happened recently?
So this isn't necessarily specific to this week, but my tomato plants have ripe tomatoes on them finally, and they are fantastic. These might be the best tomatoes that I've grown in the last 3 years that I've been growing tomatoes.
Can I tell you a secret? Every time we go out into our garden and look at our tomato plants, my husband compares them to yours and how well they are doing compared to how happy your tomato plants were when we visited you a few weeks ago.
I'm really sad that you missed the tomatoes being ripe, though.
Yeah, but you could tell they were so big and happy.
Yeah, they were very big and happy. They continue to be big and happy, but like the flavor on these tomatoes, excellent.
Oh, you're killing me.
Like they're so like crisp and flavorful and like not bitter or, like they're perfect. They're so good.
That sounds fantastic. I love tomatoes.
So that's my good thing.
That's a very good thing. Mine is also food related. It's a multi-pronged adventure enabled by the fact that I now have a chest freezer.
Ooh.
Which means I can have more than just one carton of ice cream and then nothing else in my freezer.
This is progress.
It is. I made soup stock and soup with the stock, although I haven't tried that yet, so we're just going to pretend that it's very good. That is going to be the dinner I eat when we're done recording. I promise I won't rush the episode. But yeah, I've had it sitting in the crock pot for like 2.5 days now,
Ooh.
So it should be good as hell. Out of things that have been waiting to be turned into stock in the bottom of my freezer that I could never get to because it was so tiny and full.
There's nothing like homemade stock.
I'm very excited.
Yeah, I love it. And it's so simple and easy to do.
It's a little messy, but...
Well, it depends on how you're doing it, I guess.
The number of dishes is more than just soup.
I mean, okay, so you have something, like you have to wash the dishes that allow you to strain the stuff out of the soup.
Yeah, that's really what I'm complaining about.
But I'd still say that it's very simple because basically all you do is, boil it for a long time.
Oh, simple, I agree. Yes.
Simple and easy, but there is some cleanup.
Yeah, and that's the worst part. I shouldn't complain. My parents are visiting right now, so I don't have to do any dishes. I'm an adult.
It's like when I had COVID and my parents walked my dogs for me.
Oh, hell yeah.
I'm an adult.
Living that only child life.
Yes.
I will milk that.
Absolutely.
As long as I can. Oh, now I'm sad. My other good thing was that I made meringues for the very first time, and they turned out amazing.
Ooh.
Not very pretty, because I don't actually have like a frosting bag to squirt the little meringues out with, so I just used a Ziploc bag with the corner cut off. They do look like poop emojis. But they're like the perfect amount of crunchy and delicious. And
ooh.
Again, simple, although beating egg whites for like 30 minutes was not exactly fun.
Yeah, I feel like that you need some kind of electric mixer.
Oh, I did. Yeah, no.
Oh.
My arm got tired holding the electric mixer up for so long.
Okay, so you need a stand mixer.
Yeah, this is the very first time I've ever thought, oh, I understand the point of stand mixers now.
Yeah, I've never seen the use before now, but that I can see.
I made people take shifts with me. I was like, my hand hurts. Someone else hold this. But I'm still claiming all the credit for making the meringue.
Well, it's your podcast, so you get the credit for the meringues.
Thank you. Well, Sarah, what are you drinking this evening?
I am drinking a Far West Cider Company cider.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it's quite good. They're, again, local to Northern California.
You gotta be.
Mm-hmm.
I am just drinking red wine.
Also nice.
It's good, solid, I have that soup waiting for me that is a sausage based. So I thought red wine would be a good pairing. See, I'm being thoughtful. I'm being a foodie. I'm doing wine pairings. Did you know that boxed Franzia is actually the recommended pairing for any food? It's true.
I'm sure that all of the foodstagrammers, the food influencers, agree.
They can fight me. All right. This is actually a book podcast and not a food podcast. Sarah, have you read anything good lately?
I have been reading Sherwood Smith's Rise of the Alliance book 3. I think it's called The Hunter and the Hunted, although I could be getting the name wrong. I'm quite enjoying it, although there is one character whose chapters I find very unappealing. I just don't like her character at all right now. I think she does eventually grow up and becomes a little more tolerable. But right now I find her very frustrating. But the book itself is fantastic. I'm enjoying it.
Yeah, I mean, yep.
Yeah. Have you read anything good lately? You could talk about Piranesi.
Oh, yeah. I didn't even think about that because in my brain, that's a podcast book. But isn't it? Well, I pronounce it Piranesi. Everyone on the collab that I recently did with Friends Talking Fantasy and Our Pod, everyone go listen. It's been out for probably forever by now. I don't know when this episode is coming out.
It will definitely be out by the time you're listening to this episode.
Yes. Well, everyone pronounced it differently, but I say Piranesi.
I've always read the title as Piranesi. I have no idea if that's correct or not. It's probably not.
I know that's wrong, but I think one of the other options was Piranesi. I think it's just how well can you do a bad Italian accent? How well can you do a bad Italian accent? The character is not this at all, but the man, Piranesi, was an Italian architect, and he also drew a series of absolutely bonkers labyrinth wood carvings.
I have not read the book at all, so I have no context for it except the title.
Well, the title does not have anything to do with Piranesi, really. It's just a very good reference. It's a fantastic book. I loved it. Go listen to me have a very different interpretation of it than everyone else on the podcast over at the collab on Friends Talking Fantasy.
I'm excited to listen to that episode.
There are a lot of themes of isolation, and I was like, that sounds great. Anyway, we're not talking about Piranesi this evening.
We are not. We are once again talking about a Discworld novel.
That means it's time to take another step on our journey to the center of the Discworld. World.
We really need to get some kind of special effect that you can insert there.
You mean you want me to learn how to do real editing?
The horror.
Absolutely not.
Wouldn't it be worth it just for this one spot though?
Yeah.
See?
I just gotta course my cousin who knows how to do actual sound mixing and shit to do me a solid and make us a little bit.
Yes.
Anyway, we're back for another death book. Soul music. I was gonna say, as you might guess, features death, but I guess it has the word soul in it, so I'm not wrong. Mostly because the cover is bones.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the title specifically makes one think it's a death book unless you already know Discworld. But
yeah, no.
It also happens to be our first Susan book.
Susan! I love Susan so much.
I like Susan a lot. I did forget how long it takes in this book for her to accept that the supernatural exists and that she's part of it. And I did find it went on for a little longer than I personally enjoyed.
Okay, first of all, for context, Susan is Death's granddaughter, and that's why she's part of the supernatural world. But her parents sort of separated her. She knew him growing up. We get some flashbacks, but her parents sort of removed her from that world.
I mean, you say growing up, but I think she stopped seeing him when she was 5 or so.
Yeah, okay. In her very young youths. What I was going to say is that she's still pretty young in this book. She's like a teenager, right?
think she's 17.
I wasn't aware that it was that specific, but maybe that's from something else that I don't know.
I have a note. I should also, again, I should say that we rescheduled this recording a couple of times. So I haven't read this book in like 3 weeks or 4 weeks because I read it for our original date and did not reread it for now because I'd already read it. I have a note that talks about 17-year-ago death. So she is at most 17.
Yeah, I was baffled by that note. I have no idea where that came from.
I think that they very specifically say something about him being 17 years in the past, or like this being 17 years ago.
Oh, okay. If that's the case, then yeah, Susan would be, well, she could be younger than 17, but
yeah, I think she's somewhere between 15 and 17.
I agree with that. This was a very long, meandering offshoot to say that I thought it was just very funny. She even has a line when the Raven, because the death of rats, seeks her out because death is missing. And the death of rats employs a raven to communicate between it and people. And she says, this isn't real. This isn't happening. And the raven says, but you can see this tiny rat skeleton with a black robe and a scythe right in front of you. And Susan has a line, just because I can see it doesn't mean that's any reason to believe it. That's so absurd.
It was funny. It just, sometimes I was like, come on, Susan, you've seen enough things by now. Like, you've had this conversation about 18 times.
Yeah.
Like, by now you should accept.
She was young enough, and I love her so much that I was able to just go, nah, it's funny. It's fine. I agree, though. I mean, it's absurd, right? At some point, you have to think maybe my understanding of the world is not correct.
Yeah, that's just the kind of thing that I have a low tolerance for in books.
I do when it is detrimental to the character.
I mean,
like in horror stories, when people are like, I don't think that's real, and then immediately get stabbed by the monster or whatever. But I think like Susan never wants to pick up like death's occupation. So her denying its existence is helpful for that.
She very definitely wants to be normal. I just personally find that kind of plot line frustrating after a certain point.
I mean, yeah, it probably trailed on too long.
And so for me, yeah, like it was fine in the beginning. I mean, and it's still fine because I really enjoy Susan, like as a character. I think she had great growth in this book. I like her other books. I was just like, come on, Susan, you're better than this.
Yeah.
Enough is enough.
But then we got to see the death of rats and the Raven have banter for a long time. Wasn't that worth it?
Their banter was excellent. I did like their banter.
I guess the Raven does most of the heavy lifting because the death of rats can only say squeak, but it was still a wonderful.
I don't know if I've mentioned this on the podcast, but Mr. Squeak is named after the death of rats.
You might have said that, but it's a very important piece of information. And then Mr. Squeak being your pug.
Yes, Mr. Squeak being my pug.
One half of your pugs.
Not a rat, but named after the death of rats.
If you ever hear weird snoring in the background of our podcast, that's Mr. Squeak.
Yes. Mr. Squeak, who is a girl, is the culprit.
What the heck is names, page 135?
That's a good question. This is a note that I wrote down.
Oh, LOL Sarah was my note for page 135. And it's making fun of Sarah without an H, which is your name.
Oh, I bet that is...
That's all. That's got to be your note.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure that is my note.
What is the quote?
So there's a whole section on names. Susan stared at herself critically. Susan, it wasn't a good name, was it? It wasn't a truly bad name. It wasn't like poor Iodine in the fourth form or Nigella, a name which meant, oops, we wanted a boy. But it was dull. Susan. Sue. Good old Sue. It was a name that made sandwiches, kept its head in difficult circumstances, and could reliably look after other people's children. It was a name used by no queens or goddesses anywhere. And you couldn't do much even with the spelling. You could turn it into Susie, and it sounded as though you danced on tables for a living.
Spelled Suzi.
Yes. Thank you for that important clarification. You could put in a Z and a couple of N's and an E, but it still looked like a name with extensions built on. It was as bad as Sarah, a name that cried out for prosthetic H. Funny because legally my name does have an H and I dropped it.
Just the prosthetic H is so very good.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's it. That's the extent of that point, was
Yes.
Pratchett calling you out. He calls you out later, but I think that's a spoiler comment.
He does call me out later too. I don't think I've ever been so called out by a Pratchett book.
Oh, this book. Okay. I really love the death books. In large part because of Susan, to be frank. She's absolutely the best supporting character for death, at least compared to her mother, his adopted daughter, or her father, his apprentice.
She's definitely better than them. I don't know. I think Death of Rats is on a level with her.
Oh, yeah, but Death of Rats is not the counterpoint to death in a, plot structure way.
This is true.
Yeah. I just feel like this is the third. Well, I don't feel like this is the third death book. This is the third death book in Discworld. And all three of the books that we've read so far have been about Death leaving his post, usually for a midlife crisis reason. And then someone...
Well, not usually. I mean, 2 out of 3. Reaper Man is not a midlife crisis.
Why does...
The auditors retire him.
Oh, the auditors kick him out. Okay. Well, you could still call retirement a midlife crisis. Midlife? Wouldn't that be nice? Okay. So Death leaves his post for some reason or another. How's that? Someone either takes his place or in Reaper Man does not. And it's bad for some reason or another. Either they do a bad job, like Notre, or no one takes his place and someone really, really needs to. Which is why Death of Rats goes to find Susan, because when Death leaves in this book, Death of Rats doesn't want the same kind of implosion to happen again. But even though this book is kind of just retelling the exact same story, in that way, Death keeps going through the same process. And there's something interesting in how cyclical his storyline is. I'm not quite there yet, but there's something there.
By the time we've read all 42 Discworld books, or however many there are, 40 something, maybe we will have clarified.
And I have a lot of opinions with Hogfather as well, but we're not going to talk about that. I will restrain myself. But in Soul Music, okay, so it's the third book. Death leaves his post again. There's problems with filling his role again. However, it does not feel like just a repetition. I think the Death books have sort of been building on themselves. Mort was obviously the prototype. Reaper Man was an improvement for many reasons. And then here in Soul Music, we get this same progression. However, the B plotline is so much more, I don't even want to call it the B plotline. The name of the book is Soul Music. So the rock and roll storyline is very important.
It's almost like that's the A plot line and Death leaving his post is the B plot line.
I like that. I think that is what I was trying to say this whole time.
Yeah, whereas in Reaper Man, it's very definitely the A plot line is Death leaving his post and the B plot line is the wizards.
Mm-hmm.
But here it feels like that's, inverted.
Yes, I agree completely. And I think that's why it doesn't feel stale. Or maybe that's just because I really love Death.
No, but I think there's something to that even though we see a lot of the same, I don't necessarily want to say tropes or plot points, but we do see some of the same, points between all of these books.
Would those points be plotty by any chance?
I'm trying to avoid saying plot more than I have to. The word is starting to lose all meaning.
Have you lost the plot?
I will if you keep distracting me. Yeah, no, I completely forgot what I was saying.
I'm sorry. You were saying that even though it shares a lot of the Death himself shares a lot of plot points with his previous books. However, that has now taken sort of a backseat to Susan.
Yeah,
who is much more important. And then the rock and roll music plotline, which we haven't even started talking about yet.
I think the book still feels fresh because Death leaving his post, while still central to the storyline, is not the major thread that we're following.
And it's different enough.
Yeah.
Like in Mort, when Mort takes the place of Death, he's been apprenticing. He has been practicing. He knows, theoretically, he knows what he's supposed to do. Susan had forgotten her entire childhood with Death because her mind, right? Human minds just block out weird stuff. That's a common thing in Discworld.
And also she was like 5.
Yeah, but that you would remember a skeleton, I think.
I don't know. I don't really remember anything from when I was 5 or younger.
Really?
Not really.
I have some like really vivid memories of like I could picture where I went to school and stuff.
I mean, I could picture that too. It helps that like I walk by there every day, but
like, and you don't remember like the insides of classrooms?
I mean, I guess I do.
Yeah.
I guess I do.
The only reason why you don't think remembering our grandparents' house is because it was exactly the same forever. And so it doesn't feel like it counts as remembering from when we were young.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah. But so she's thrown into this with absolutely no context and just the death of rats to try to like show her the ropes. Her, the death of rats, and the raven it's one of the best dynamics in all of Discworld, I think. The raven is so sassy. The death of rats is so sweet. And Susan becomes a badass eventually, and we get to see her grow into that. And by badass, I mean assertive. But isn't that the same thing?
It is nice seeing Susan learn to stand up for herself a little more than she does at the beginning of the book.
I mean, in this book, it's a pretty small step. Okay, here we go. The name of the book does indeed suggest that there is a strong music plotline. That is correct.
Yes.
There are so many classic rock, music-y, etc. references.
I'm sure that there are way more references than either of us actually caught.
To start with, the other main character, Imp, is basically possessed by the soul of rock and roll. To greatly oversimplify it.
Impy Selwyn, I'm mispronouncing it horribly, I'm sure, which does translate, I believe that is Welsh, and does translate to Bud of the Holly.
Are you saying that he's a reference to Buddy Holly?
I mean, you know?
Yeah, so anyway, Buddy Holly is one of the big ones. I'm just going to run through a list of the really obvious ones to give a vibe, and then I'm going to share the quote of my favorite one. We had, "Born to ruin," what a wizard inscribes on his jacket. "Rebel without a pause." And "Felonious monk." The day the music died, one of the songs is called "My Balls Are on Fire." And there's another song called "Don't Step on My Shoes," or something to that effect. The song titles are less charming to me because that's kind of sticks out like a sore thumb, in my opinion. But "Rebel Without a Pause" and "Felonious Monk" were both seamlessly worked into the prose of the book in a way that is so much more delightful. And I'm going to read you that section to prove that I'm right. "Who's the greatest horn player there ever was?" "Brother Charnel," the dwarf replied. "Everyone knows that. He stole the altar gold from the temple of Offler and had it made into a horn and played magical music until the gods caught up with him and pulled his..." "Right," said Buddy. "But if you went out there now and asked who the most famous horn player is, would they remember some felonious monk or would they shout for you?" And that's good.
I mean, as expected, Terry Pratchett is very witty.
Yeah. Working it into the story like that instead of the other references, which are just like, isn't it funny that this song name is kind of similar to a real song? It's a level above.
Yeah, I won't argue there.
There's another thing that Pratchett does extremely well in this book, which he does not actually have a great track record with. So good job, honey.
Growth.
Yes. There is a joke concerning the topic of racism, but it's making fun of the racists instead of being racist. And good job. That's how you're supposed to do it. I actually thought the passage itself was hilarious.
It's nice to see the wizards get their comeuppance for trying to be assholes.
They're pretty snotty a lot, even to each other. So having someone out clever them just because someone knows they're racist and uses it back against them, it's very satisfying.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Sarah, before we dive deeper into the spoilerific conversation about soul music by Terry Pratchett, when should someone read this book?
Because this is the first Susan book, you do get some world building and explanations that mean you can follow along if you haven't read any Discworld books prior to this. So you could start with this as your first Discworld book. I'm not thrilled with it as the first book. I think there are better places to start, but I think that you could start with this.
To quibble a little bit, this is a death book that Susan appears in, right? Like,
yes.
Susan does not have her own series of Discworld books. She just appears in the death series at this point.
I mean, I think you could say that she has her sub-series.
Okay.
Because she has more than two.
Fair enough.
That qualifies as sub-series for me.
All right. Yeah, I agree. There are probably better places to start, but it's a good book if you like music, classic rock, etc., and puns and bad references. You'd really enjoy this book. And it does a pretty good job of holding your hand since Susan has to be introduced to everything. Not everything, but enough of it that I feel like you could catch on if you wanted to start here.
Yeah.
To avoid spoilers, skip to 3655.
I think one of my big light bulb moments, it wasn't that deep, but there are two bands that get the most page time in this book. And one is Music with Rocks In, which is the main character. It's an ensemble. We get all of the characters in this band, but Imp, who's the one possessed by the spirit of rock and roll, is in this band. And it's all about the music. They don't get paid at all, really, which we'll touch on later. And it's not really good because Imp isn't even really a person by the end of the book. All he can say is, we just need to play music. And then he goes and lies down and is basically comatose in between performances.
He should also be dead at that point, and it's only the spirit of rock and roll that's keeping him alive.
Right. But still not great.
No, still not great. Yeah. I'm not arguing there.
But there's another band we see, which goes through like 5 or 6 different names, which adds to the hilarity. But they're all about the image. They spend all of their time working on their costumes and their like power poses. And it's very explicit in the book that they don't know how to play their instruments at all, which neither does Imp. But he's possessed by the spirit of rock and roll, so it doesn't matter.
They did kind of remind me, this is just this parallel is solely because of the name changes. They did kind of remind me of the other 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in Good Omens, and how there's the one of them who changes his name all the time.
I thought you were going to say Mouse Rat from Parks and Recreation.
I have not watched Parks and Recreation.
Well, that's a band in that show. And Mouse Rat is the most commonly returned to name, but they go through a lot of different names.
Ah, that does sound similar.
Yes.
Not a reference I am capable of making.
That's all right. And everyone hates, I'm going to call them the Insanity, because I think that's the name that we hear the most on the page. But everyone hates their music and boos them off stage constantly, whereas everyone loves Music with Rocks In. And so you get that like very strong comparison between doing good music and having great costumes. Maybe this should have gone into fashion. I don't know.
On the other hand, they do still get gigs, so.
That's true.
We mentioned in the non-spoiler section that Terry Pratchett calls me out specifically by name. Well, he does call me out specifically by name, but we said that there were 2 things. First was the name, and the second is Dibbler has a comment. Dibbler becomes the manager for Music with Rocks In, which we'll talk about in a minute. But Dibbler has a comment about how he's buying shirts, concert t-shirts, essentially. And people wanted clothes just because they had writing on. And boy, do I resemble that remark.
I'm in this picture and I don't like it.
Yeah, the way that I like, if I go to a place and they have like, a brand shirt, I'm like, I want that. I want that t-shirt.
Well, there are a lot of, I won't even call them parallels. They're not even subtle. Pratchett is just lambasting the way the music industry is treated, not on a particularly deep level, just with the really obvious, merchandise, commercialism, and also managers. Dibbler is a character who has showed up maybe in every Discworld book as a scummy con artist, basically. He does sell things, but like the food is all poison because it's so low quality. He's someone that we are very familiar with at this point as being someone with no morals.
He's not a lowlife in the way that I think your description makes it sound, but he's not. He's a businessman who doesn't think of the implications sometimes.
And I think that's a little too kind. So he is somewhere in the middle. And he becomes the manager for the band Music with Rocks in. And that's just so perfect. That is just such a, not subtle at all, but maybe subtextual, we'll say, absolutely savage burn on how managers treat their bands. He pays them like
pennies, basically.
Yeah, I was trying to do very quick math. 0.1% of their revenue?
He pockets all of the profit.
All of it.
Because these poor naive musicians don't know what they're worth. And so they're asking for like 10 gold to split between them. And they're taking in 10 gold per ticket, and selling out all these big venues.
To be fair, Glod does figure it out pretty quickly.
Laud is also a very bad negotiator.
Oh, yeah, but he knows he's being taken advantage of, at least. You can be a bad negotiator, but not naive.
That's true.
Yeah. Because the second he sees the ticket price, he just like, wait, hold on.
But then he asks for like 17 gold per person.
Yeah. Okay.
Which is still not great, given how much they're bringing in.
Okay, I mean, yeah, Dibbler's absolutely taking advantage of them, 100%. But that's just another way that this book so closely mirrors reality, isn't it?
True. One thing, and I don't have a lot to say about this because it has been like 3 weeks, but I really like at the very end where Imp is more buddy than Imp. Terry Pratchett does a really good job at distinguishing like the very subtle differences. So when it's Imp talking, Imp being, the bard who wants to make his way in the world. And when it's Buddy talking, which is this rock star who's basically subsumed by the spirit of rock and roll. And I liked seeing the transition from Imp to Buddy and back to Imp throughout the book, and how you can tell by like speech patterns and just these small little things that aren't explicitly spelled out, but you pick up on. I thought that was a really nice, subtle way to distinguish between the spirit of rock and roll and the original character.
I also experienced that, but I read half of this book when we were first supposed to record, and then the second half today. So when I got to the part where Imp was more himself again, I was like, why are there typos in my book? There's not that many L's in the word all. I'm so confused. And it took me maybe a little bit longer to catch on to, oh, that's because this is Imp again. And Buddy, which is his stage name, Buddy is sort of fallen back.
Yes.
And I think if I had read the book in closer to one go, I might have figured that out quicker.
Yes, I think that's probably a little more obvious when you don't have a big gap in between, reading the first half of the book and the second.
Yeah. I did notice it though, and I did like it once I figured out what was going on. I also really enjoyed basically every moment with the wizards. I don't always love the wizards in Discworld. I don't dislike them, but they're not usually my favorite part. But they are gold every moment of this book that they're in.
The Wizard books are usually my favorite books. So I obviously really enjoyed their part in this book.
Oh, just the image, the mental image. Rock and roll music infects everyone who listens to it. And so everyone starts turning into an angsty teen. And so you have this group of octogenarians, half of which are acting like angsty teens.
It's great.
It's so funny. It's not particularly deep humor, but it's really funny.
I do really want kind of a jean jacket that says Born to Ruin on it.
A Dean jacket?
A Dean jacket, yes.
And there's an argument at one point about how rock and roll music is changing people, and it just devolves into, this room is a mess, you need to clean your room and you can't tell me what to do. It's so out of character. It's great.
It's really funny seeing Ridcully, the Arch Chancellor, who's not affected by the music in quite the same way. Like he's not devolving into the teenager, but he does turn into the parent.
Yeah.
So seeing that contrast is very funny.
But we also get some really good moments that are less soul music specific. We got to see Ridcully interacting with students.
Actually, I think well, Stibbins at this point is faculty, but the rest of them are grad students. It's true.
Okay, but it's his absolute disdain and bafflement for the fact that there are students at this school is also hilarious to me.
I think that's a really good running joke throughout all of the Wizard books, or whenever the Wizards show up, is how horrified they are by the concept of students at this university, at this place of learning.
It's just so good. It's, again, very simple, but very funny.
Simple but effective.
That's true. So I'm not sure if this counts as a pet peeve or a words are weird. Or maybe this is my pet peeve because there are weird words. But I notice it mostly in Pratchett. I'm pretty sure it's just a British English thing. But when you end a phrase on a preposition, it always sounds so awkward to me.
Like music with rocks in.
Yeah, exactly.
Or Dibbler's quote, people wanted clothes just because they had writing on.
Yeah, on them. I know it's just a British English thing, but it sounds so awkward. It's like nails on a chalkboard.
It definitely gives me pause whenever I see it. I don't think it's not at that level for me of nails on a chalkboard, and I do associate it mostly with Terry Pratchett, I have to say.
I think he uses it in a much more titular way, not as the titles of his book, obviously, but when it shows up, he's using it to emphasize a point, and so it sticks out a lot, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Which almost feels like he's in on the joke. Like, yeah, is it this awful? Now you have to pay attention to it.
Yeah.
I guess that's grammar is weird more than words are weird.
Yeah, it's not a specific word.
Right. Sentence construction.
English is weird.
We'll leave it as a pet peeve then. Yeah. We'll call it a pet peeve because I know that I'm probably not the only person in the world. You even admitted that you agree with me. So that actually probably means that most people feel this way, since if we overlap.
I don't know if I would go that far, but you are not alone in the world in this particular pet peeve, I think.
Like, no way. There's no way. It's one of those things where I completely understand where it's coming from and have no problem with it intellectually, but it's when I encounter it in the wild, it's like,
it's just jarring.
No. Yeah. But then I get over it and keep reading because turns out not everyone speaks like me. I just have to get over that, unfortunately.
It's true.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Fiction Fans.
Come disagree with us. We're on Twitter and Instagram @FictionFansPod. You can also email us at fictionfanspod@gmail.com.
If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and follow us wherever your podcasts live.
We also have a Patreon where you can support us and find our show notes and a lot of other nonsense.
Thanks again for listening, and may your villains always be defeated. Bye.
Bye.